It began not with a grand ceremony, but with the low, vibrating rumble of machinery cutting into earth that had long waited for such a promise to be kept. Across the arid terrain of Burkina Faso, the open savannas of Mali, and the sprawling Sahel of Niger, a new rhythm was beginning to pulse through the soil, the sound of tracks being laid not just for trains but for the future, and as workers toiled under a harsh sun, welding steel and anchoring sleepers, there was a shared sense among citizens, governments, and regional leaders that this was more than a railway. It was a spine connecting economies that had too long been fractured by colonial neglect and post-independence underdevelopment, and now, the first real signal of intra-African collaboration in decades was taking shape in the form of an iron corridor promising to deliver trade, mobility, employment, and pride to millions who had been reduced to waiting for opportunities to arrive from outside. This was not just infrastructure, it was defiance against the old patterns that saw landlocked nations suffer endlessly from isolation, their exports languishing on potholed roads, their imports arriving too late and too expensive, and for the first time, the presidents of these three nations, once struggling with political instability, now unified in vision, stood together at the junction of ambition and steel, declaring that this railway would carry goods, yes, but also dignity, sovereignty, and shared purpose, and even in remote villages where skepticism still lingered, children watched the convoys of trucks and cranes roll past with wide eyes, their parents quietly daring to imagine what it might mean to have a future that wasn't defined by waiting for distant capitals to notice their need. The railway's route itself was a bold statement, stretching from the heart of Niamey in Niger through the agricultural arteries of Mali and sweeping into the economic zones of Burkina Faso before ultimately promising access to ports on the Atlantic coast, a dream that had danced at the edges of policy documents for decades, now breaking ground in real dust and real metal, and with every kilometer completed, a new era of connectivity was being forged. Not just between countries, but between rural farms and urban markets, between mining operations and international buyers, between students and universities, between families long separated by lack of access and the harsh cost of travel. This was an artery of possibility, of cultural exchange and economic transformation, and it was being funded not by the old aid models with strings attached but through a consortium of African-led investments, regional development banks, and a careful balancing act of sovereignty and support, particularly in the face of a global environment still marked by skepticism toward African-led mega-projects. Yet this time the skepticism seemed to matter less, because the resolve of the project leaders, engineers, and policy makers was rooted in a historical urgency that transcended cynicism, the recognition that no foreign entity would ever prioritize African integration the way Africans themselves must. Every nail driven into a railway tie was also a quiet response to centuries of exploitative extraction, and for once, the continent wasn't just sending minerals to ships, it was keeping value closer to home. As the project advanced, technical teams from all three nations worked in unprecedented coordination, adapting engineering designs to cope with multiple climate zones, shifting terrain, and the logistical challenge of crossing borders historically designed to divide rather than unite. And in this, too, there was symbolism, the deliberate dismantling of colonial-era infrastructure patterns that linked each country more closely to Europe than to each other, and so bridges were built not only over rivers but over histories, as legal teams drafted shared customs protocols, as digital systems were installed to track cargo with continental standards, and as regional languages and dialects were respected at every station along the emerging line, proving that integration did not mean homogenization. It meant collaboration rooted in mutual respect, and the workers, most of them locals trained through accelerated vocational programs, found in their tasks not just a paycheck but a sense of participation in something monumental, something generational, and every time they paused for water or shade, they could see the transformation under their own feet, feel the coming acceleration of time and opportunity pressing forward on steel rails that would outlast them, carrying generations ahead. In the capitals, policy debates once centered on food insecurity and insurgencies now found new ground in logistics management and export strategies, as ministries recalibrated national priorities to accommodate the economic corridors the railway would unlock. And while no one believed that infrastructure alone could erase poverty, there was consensus that this project had shifted the ceiling of what was possible. It had made ambition pragmatic, and in turn, had forced even the most skeptical voices in the global development community to reevaluate how they viewed West Africa. Investment conferences suddenly included panels on Sahelian logistics, international shipping companies began conducting feasibility studies on inland depots, and diasporas long disconnected from their roots began returning with new ventures, drawn not just by nostalgia but by the hard reality that mobility now meant viability, and viability meant investment. Slowly, a narrative shift took place, from crisis to construction, from waiting to building, and it was felt not just in government buildings but in marketplaces, in classrooms, in homes where for the first time children heard their parents speak of tomorrow without hesitation. Still, challenges were not absent. Security threats loomed on parts of the route where extremist violence remained a concern, and both international observers and local citizens questioned whether the railway could sustain progress in areas still destabilized by regional conflict. But rather than slow down, the project adapted. Security protocols were integrated into construction timelines, local militias were engaged in dialogue to protect rather than disrupt infrastructure, and the governments, aware of the project's symbolic weight, took unprecedented steps to synchronize intelligence sharing and community engagement, demonstrating that infrastructure and peacebuilding need not be separate efforts, and that perhaps stability could come not only from foreign peacekeeping but from a shared investment in something too valuable to destroy. This pragmatic optimism began to ripple outward, encouraging communities along the track to organize cooperatives, to prepare for the commercial inflows they had once only dreamed of, and though not every village would get a station, every village would be closer to one, and that alone was transformative. As the first test trains rolled across newly finished segments, empty, save for officials and engineers, it wasn't the speed that mattered but the symbolism. Here was a machine designed not for show but for service, an instrument of continuity across fractured lands, and onlookers filmed the test runs with pride, uploading them to social media where they were met not with mockery but with hope, and across the continent, other nations watched with curiosity, considering their own dormant plans, their own regional possibilities, and even beyond Africa, analysts in Beijing, Brussels, and Washington took note, not just of the rails, but of the model. Collaboration without dependency, execution without spectacle, and a long-term vision guided not by donor mandates but by continental consensus. And as the project moved toward completion, it became clear that it was not just a railway. It was a new axis of power, soft and hard, economic and cultural, and for West Africa, so often described in deficit, it was finally a headline born not of despair but of design. Among the youth, especially, the railway became a symbol of new identity, neither overly nationalistic nor bound to old Pan-African slogans, but something current, rooted in real movement, in real access, and as vocational programs expanded to train young people in railway maintenance, logistics, hospitality, and supply chain management, a new generation began to view their own nations not as places to escape but as places worth investing in. And even artists responded, composing songs and murals in tribute to the steel serpent that now wound its way through their homeland, a literal line connecting memory to possibility, and slowly, a new mythology began to emerge, not of colonial conquest or post-colonial failure, but of African capacity asserting itself in metal and motion. At the diplomatic level, the project created new trust. Meetings between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that once descended into protocol battles or budget disputes were now anchored in shared responsibility, with railway oversight committees functioning not as bureaucracies but as laboratories for real-time cooperation. And this trust extended beyond the tracks, bleeding into broader alliances on energy, security, and migration, as the tangible success of a shared goal built the muscle for more ambitious integration. And for the African Union, the project became a cornerstone case study, a pilot for what could be achieved when sovereignty was used as a basis for cooperation, not division. And finally, for the ordinary citizens, the traders, the farmers, the schoolchildren, the nurses, the truck drivers, the storytellers, the railway began to embed itself not just as infrastructure but as life force, a background hum that meant fewer hours walking under sun, fewer goods spoiled on dirt roads, fewer letters lost between borders, and more reunions, more possibility, more time, more choice, and in this way, the largest railway project on the continent was also its quietest revolution, not erupting in fanfare, but unfolding day by day, mile by mile, into the lived reality of a continent not waiting to be saved, but simply moving forward, on its own rails, in its own direction, toward a horizon it could finally reach on its own terms.